Hi, it's Mr. Anderson, and this is Environmental Science Video 14. It's on human population size. One of the pioneers in this field was Thomas Malthus, put forward this essay on how changes in our population in the past and in the future will impact human happiness. It's not really a happy story. It's called the Malthusian catastrophe. And so countries can produce food, but they can only increase food production in a linear fashion. And we know that populations increase exponentially. So as long as you're in the green, you're okay. But once our population surpasses the amount of food that we can produce, we've got a catastrophe. We've got famine. People are going to die. Now, this happened in the last century. Countries like Mexico and India saw that the food production was not increasing at a rate that could supply food for their growing population. So what did they do? They brought in the biologists. Norman Borlaug came in, brought in new farming practices, new varieties. We called this the Green Revolution, and it solved the problem. It's a pretty nice thing to put on your resume, saved 1 billion lives. Now, that's just one solution. We can increase through technology food production, or we could simply stabilize that population. And we know that human populations have been stable for a long time and have only increased exponentially through industrialization. Once we have constant food, modern sanitation, modern medicine, populations will simply take off. Now, what's going to happen to the world population into the future? It's a really hard question to answer because we're not just one country. We're a world that's made up of a number of different continents and different countries on that. And each of those are at different stages along what's called the demographic transition. But we have powerful tools. We have age structure diagrams. I talked about that in the last video, that are a snapshot of the population but can give us some predictions of what may happen in the future. And then we have history of this demographic transition. We know what happens to countries as they are industrialized. In other words, the population will increase, stabilize, and then we find that it actually starts to drop off. Now, if you're either side of this, as your population is taking off, it puts pressure on the environment and on the economy. And so that's bad. And as it drops off, now we don't have people in the workforce who can supply economy for the people who have retired. And so where do you want your population? You want it stable. Maybe not here, or maybe here. We want our population to remain the same. And countries can see this happening. And so what can they do? Well, they could just let it occur, or they can institute policy that can make changes. Both policy changes that affect overpopulation, so that increasing population, or that population decline. The most famous example is China's one-child policy, but we'll talk about some other ones as well. And so if we look at where we are today, 2015, there are 7.3 billion people on our planet. What does the UN predict our population is going to do into the future? Well, we've got high, medium, and low predictions. So which of these is right? We don't know. We'll have to see what's going to happen into the future. And the reason it's difficult is that we have all these different continents. So Asia right now has 4 billion people, but it could, increase to the point where there are more people in Asia than there are people on the planet today, or it may not. You can see that Africa is definitely going to increase into the future and that some areas are actually going to decrease. But we've got these regions that are broken down into countries. Now in AP Environmental, you should know the top 10 as far as population goes, countries on the planet. You probably could guess a few of those. It's going to be China, India, then the US, and then we go to Indonesia, Brazil, we've got Pakistan, Nigeria, this would be Bangladesh, Russia, and then Japan. And so if you look at the population of these countries, just those countries account for about 60% of the population on our planet. Now, is that going to be the same percent into the future? Probably not. Because if we look at that same map and look at the growth rate, you can see that in some areas like the US, it's increasing. In a lot of these areas, the population's actually decreasing. In a lot of sub-Saharan Africa, it's really increasing into the future. And so that top 10 is definitely going to change as we look into the future. And what's going on is we have all these countries going through the industrialization. And we talked about that in the last video. It's this demographic transition. And so what happens is, first of all, the death rate drops, then the birth rate drops. And so if we're looking at what happens to the population over time, during this transition, it'll radically increase, then it'll stabilize, and then it's eventually going to drop off. And so this is just a model. It doesn't always work exactly this way, but it's a pretty good prediction on what's going to happen as countries start to industrialize. Now, is anybody in type 1 Not really. So there are some countries due to war and like the AIDS epidemic in Africa that are pushing them back into 1. But in generally, they're either in phase 2, 3, or 4. So if we look at some ones that are in different phases, Nigeria, so this is UN predictions. All these lines are different predictions, but this would be the average prediction. This is what we think will happen to Nigeria into the future. So by 2100, we could have maybe 700 million people in Nigeria. So you can see that's going to move it way up on the list. Where would we put that? It's somewhere in here in phase 2. If we look at the US, you can see into the future, it's going to stabilize. If we look at birth and death rates, it should be stable, but we have a lot of immigration coming into the US. And then if we look at Japan, you can see that into the future, the population in Japan is radically going to drop off. And so we would put Japan in this phase 4 right here. And so remember, a model that we've used throughout this whole course is the idea of sustainability, that the Earth, or the country in this case, has to support society, which is driven by economy. And so as the society gets larger and larger, it puts more constraints on the environment. But sometimes when the population gets smaller, it puts more constraints on the society itself when we don't have people working anymore.